Weber Kettle series brought to you by Fogo Charcoal here on Chuds BBQ, everybody. My name is Bradley Robinson, and today we're cooking up some classic Texas-style spare ribs on the Weber Kettle. Coming up! These are some spare ribs. Patted dry. So this is the full spare rib, not to be confused with the St. Louis cut or the baby back ribs. Because much like us, pigs have a rib cage that comes from their spine all the way around to the front to protect all our organs and whatnot. And when getting butchered, they get sliced right about here, giving us your baby back ribs, which is the backside of your pork loin, and then your belly ribs, which is the bony backside of the pork belly. So that's the main difference between baby backs and spare ribs. It's belly meat versus loin meat. Then there's also the St. Louis cut, which is a full spare that's just been trimmed up, chine bone removed, flap meat removed, squared up all nice, and all that knuckle meat on top is gone. St. Louis cut ribs are great for the backyard cook because they're already trimmed up, so there's nothing you really have to do to them except for throw some seasoning on and throw them on the pit. But because of all that butchery that someone else did, St. Louis cut are often a lot more expensive than this full spare, which is what we cook here in Texas. So to trim this up, much like a St. Louis rib, we're going to take off this chine bone right here. And if you look, it's bone and cartilage, and if you go right between, you can just zip this whole thing right off. I like to use a good chef's knife for this, something with a little bit more weight than a boning knife to really cut through that cartilage right there. Really easy to get through, but a bigger knife helps out. So this cut is a big old bone, not gonna make a great rib, and the bone's running this way. This is all a big piece of bone. So if you were to leave this on, you wouldn't be able to cut through it. And you'd have to remove this at the end anyway if you ever wanted to cut these ribs apart. So, gotta take this off. This makes for a great little pitmaster snack if you throw it on. Not something I would serve to anyone at a restaurant, but in the backyard, a lot of meat on there. You can also take all this meat off, use it for sausage, save that bone for stock. You know the drill. Next thing we're gonna do is remove this skirt meat on the back. Definitely don't wanna leave that on, because otherwise it's gonna cook up all weird. It's really thin. You're gonna get rub trapped underneath it. It's gonna dry out. Real easy to take off. Next thing we're gonna do is square off this end. Again, you could leave this on, but this is gonna burn up. Some of these baby ribs are just not gonna make for a great eating, not a great presentation. They're gonna kind of burn up a little bit. So I like to find the first major rib in here and kind of just square it off right after that. Again, great for sausage or a little pit snack. Flip it over, flip it over. So at this point, we're looking pretty good. We still got some trimming to do though, because we've got this chunk of meat right here, this little flap hanging off. We don't want that. Again, it's just gonna burn up. And because there's a big layer of fat underneath it, when that fat renders out, all this meat and this meat will wanna slide off when we're cutting it down the road. So I'm gonna go through and zip that off real quick. Same for this piece. I do like to leave all this fat on there though. These are my favorite ribs for that very reason. So at this point, all we need to do is shape it up, because the bones run right to about this fat line right here. So all this meat up top here has the potential to dry out. So what I like to do is make sure it's nice and flat on the table and just kind of follow this cut and terminate it right about here, just to give this thing some good shape. Round off that tip, and there we have it, a beautiful looking trimmed up rack of spare ribs. Yet again, if this was going to be St. Louis cut, that cut would be right at the top of the bone, which is somewhere in this region. So that's why your St. Louis cuts are nicely squared off, because it's just this section. But with these, we get all this meat up here, nice fatty meat on there. You got the rest of this little collagen section in there, which is some of the best meat on the whole rib. So that's why we like to do a whole spare rib. It's the cheapest rib available, does not take much trimming, and you end up with much bigger ribs. Looking real nice. And always look for ones with the best striations of fat in there. You know the drill. Let's get these seasoned up. For our rub today, we're gonna keep it simple, like most things in Texas barbecue, with some good old-fashioned kosher salt and some 16 mesh black pepper. But much like pork belly, spare ribs really lend themselves to a whole bunch of different flavor profiles really well. You could go really savory, really sweet, really saucy. The world is yours. So any store-bought rub will work really well on spare ribs, and they're really fun to experiment getting different flavor profiles. But today we're going just salt and pepper, which is really all you need for some great flavor and some great color on your ribs. And then we're gonna add some more flavor with spritzes and sauces down the road. So, simply enough, we're gonna go on with a nice even layer of some Diamond Crystal kosher salt. And remember, this is a thin meat, so you don't wanna go too heavy on the salt, but you also don't have to be too shy. Nice even coating like that should work out just fine. And as always, we're starting on the back side here, and that's so we can maintain our presentation side, which is the meat side, of course. Looking good. And I'm not really a big fan of slathers on spare ribs. I think they can kind of deter smoke penetration a little bit, and I never have any problems with rubs sticking to these. A lot of people like to put mustard or Worcestershire or something on there, but I don't find it necessary. And also, because these are gonna sit out for about 10-15 minutes while we get the kettle fired up, that salt, which we put on first, is gonna draw out moisture from the ribs, which is then gonna help all that pepper stick. And as always, folks, don't forget the sides. Come on, even on ribs. Boom, looking good to me. Let's fire up the pit. with our classic setup today for low and slow. So we got some of the black bag Fogo premium lump charcoal in our slow and sear here. And I'm just gonna light it on one end so it kind of burns like a snake all the way throughout this cook, which should give us about 4 or 5 hours of low and slow heat around 300 degrees, which is exactly what we want for cooking a rack of spare ribs. I'm also going on with some pecan wood. I really like pecan for pork, especially ribs. Adds some wonderful flavor. Just a couple of chunks here and there, so as it burns this way, these will ignite periodically, giving us some wonderful smoke, hands-free. Go ahead and fill up that little water reservoir while we're at it. And on we go with our beautiful spare ribs that the rub is not coming off of. I'm gonna go bone side, bottom of the bone side, towards the fire for this cook. It's gonna help that meat kind of pull back from the bones a little bit. It's also much fattier on this side than it is on that top knuckle side. Bottom vents are wide open, as they always are. Lid goes on. Gonna keep this wide open until we dial in our temps. Like I mentioned, 275 to 300 degrees for this cook on this thermometer here. And we will check back in a little bit. It's been about 10-15 minutes and we are not even above 200 degrees yet. So that means my fire is not quite caught. Nice and smoky though. Love me a handy dandy little leaf blower, folks. That ought to do. As I mentioned, there's a whole world of opportunities when it comes to adding extra flavor to your ribs. And one thing I really like to do is add a sugary sweet spritz towards the end of the cook to add that really nice sheen, a nice glaze, and of course, some wonderful sweetness. And generally what I'll do is I'll grab a little squirt bottle like this, fill it up with some apple cider vinegar, and then pour in a syrup of some sort. Typically maple syrup or honey, but today we're gonna go with a brown sugar simple syrup. So, into this little pot here, I'm gonna go in with some apple cider vinegar, 1 cup. We're just gonna let that come up to a simmer. Beautiful. Once there, we're gonna go in with the exact same amount, volumetrically, of some brown sugar. We're just gonna whisk that until it is completely dissolved and we've got ourselves a super basic, simple syrup. But to add a little extra flavor, I've also got a couple of crushed cloves of some garlic in here. And we'll throw in a bay leaf as well, why not? If I had some thyme or rosemary or herbs or something, that would work as well. So I'm gonna cook this on low for another couple of minutes until everything is fully dissolved and all that flavor has been released. And then I'm gonna pop it into the fridge to cool down so we can finish our spritz a little later on in the cook. We're about 2.5 hours into this cook. It started to creep a little bit above 300, so I shut these vents down a little bit. It's been sitting at 250 for the last 20-30 minutes or so, which is where I've been trying to aim this whole time, between 250 and 300. Let's see how they're looking. Ooh, starting to get some lovely color on there. A little crispy around the edges. Not loving that so much, looking a little on the dark side. I usually like a nice red rib, not so much a dark rib, but that's all right. It is the nature of the Weber Kettle. You can see the corners where the hot spots are, is where this thing is getting toasted. But I've already done this once, but I've got a little squirty squirt here of just some apple cider vinegar. This is just apple cider vinegar. We're gonna add the brown sugar towards the end, but just trying to keep these edges a little bit spritzed so nothing cooks too quickly or burns up too much. But it's also at this stage that I'm gonna flip these over. And that's because we wanna get some color on the underside of these ribs as well. You can see how it's much paler on this side. So this will help get smoke penetration on both sides, as well as crisp up this membrane, because I did in fact leave the membrane on, which is something I usually do when cooking ribs. There's a lot of fat under this membrane. You can see a pocket of it right here that I want to keep in there. Once it renders down, the membrane will hold all that fat in and it'll help kind of cook the ribs from the inside and make sure everything is nice and juicy. Fire is looking good. I may go in and throw on another chunk of wood just to make sure we get some lovely smoke on this side. And then I'm going to close it down and let it keep on cooking. And the reason I like to flip the ribs a few hours into the cook as opposed to just starting them out bone side up is because that meat side is our presentation side. And I really want to make sure the bark is set and we got some good color on there before I flip it over. Otherwise, we would have ended up with those grill marks on the presentation side, which is not what we want. And if you're on a really convective cooker, you may not have to flip them at all, but I found it works out really well, especially for crisping up that membrane and making sure we get wonderful color all the way around. So once that bottom side starts looking better, get some good color and smoke on there, and that membrane starts to render down a little bit, we'll probably flip them back over and start spritzing with our brown sugar simple syrup. All right, another hour and a half or so has gone by, and that underside is looking beautiful. See all that nice fat we've got pooling in there? That's extra flavor. Wonderful color on here. So now we're gonna flip it back over and start spritzing. Ooh-hoo, feeling nice and tender. Smelling real nice. So now to our little squirty squirt bottle here full of apple cider vinegar. We're gonna pop this top off real quick. And we're gonna add in some of our simple syrup we made earlier. After this cooled down, I strained out the garlic and the bay leaves and whatnot. We're just gonna add this right on in. And we want this to be nice and sweet, nice and tangy, but still viscous enough to be able to come out of the squirt bottle. So now for the next hour or so, I'm gonna go ahead and give this a few spritzes. That's gonna really set that glaze, get some nice sweetness and some nice flavor on there while this thing finishes cooking. Ribs are coming off the old Weber Kettle. Again, looking much darker than I'm used to. Must be a kettle thing, but flavor's still gonna be there. So now I'm gonna sauce them up with some Gabrick candy jalapeno. Because what doesn't sound good about that on some ribs? So on we go. Oh, that looks lovely. Little bit of sweet, little bit of heat. Perfect for ribs. Just a nice lovely glaze on there. Lovely color, still very dark. Might be the pecan, might be the lack of airflow. Either way, we're gonna flip these over and we're gonna hit the backside as well. Rub that down all nice, and then we're gonna wrap this up. But before I do, first of all, we're gonna keep it bone side up. That way, any more juices that come pouring out of this thing will accumulate onto the meat, giving it even more tenderization. And usually I'll go in with some butter at this point, just for some extra fat and flavor. But the folks at South Chicago Packing Company just came out with this stuff. Iberico pork fat. Yeah, we're gonna give that a try. If you're gonna tallow your brisket, you might as well lard your ribs. That is not a pleasant sentence, but I stand by it. Oops, looking good to me. These ribs are about 175 degrees internal right now, which is usually where I wrap them up on an offset cooker. Back on the Weber these go until we get nice and tender and they feel really good inside, and probably an internal temp of around 200, 205 degrees. It was about a 6-hour cook on these spare ribs, which is to be expected, pretty typical for spare ribs. It was about 3 hours bone side down to set the bark, 1 hour bone side up to cook the underside, another hour bone side down to set the glaze, and then sauced and wrapped for another hour to finish. And at this point, they have come up to an internal temp of about 200 degrees, but more importantly, they are just feeling nice and floppy, nice and spongy in a good way. That means we know they're tender, that sauce has had a chance to cook on, and I know it's a lot of work to flip a rack of ribs 3 times in 6 hours, so I apologize for the laborious cook. But that being said, I'm gonna let these rest for about 30 minutes or so till they come down to an internal temp around 150, and then we'll slice on in. Oh, that smells heavenly. Oops. And there we have it, folks. A beautiful, nice, tender, barky rack of ribs off the Weber Kettle. I think it's time to slice in. So when slicing ribs, I usually take it from behind. So to slice ribs, especially if you're a beginner, I recommend going from the bone side. You could try and aim between the bones, but you're likely going to mess it up. And at this point, we're not gonna mess this bark up any by flipping it onto the table. Just aim between the bones. The bones do have a natural curve to them, something to notice. Like this bone is pretty straight. This one I can see is jetting in this direction. But look at that, folks. Beautiful, meaty rib. Nice and tender, nice and juicy. Got a lovely smoke ring on there. Wonderful crust. Yep, looking juicy. And that is what a beautiful sliced rack of ribs looks like. Go for the center cut guy right here. I mean, what's not to like about that, folks? That's what you're looking for. Perfect bite through consistency. Doesn't pull off the bones, but it goes clean to it. That's really nice. That sauce, very tasty. Another bite reveals a perfectly cooked rib. Look at that. Love to see it. And with the slightest tug, clean bone. Boop. Come on. It's a good rib. Very nice sweetness to it from that spritz, as well as the sweetness from that sauce. Wonderful smoke flavor on there. Nice and juicy, nice and tender. As you saw in that last bite, that membrane did not get in the way at all. I mean, what's not to like about that? And like I say in most of these Weber Kettle videos, if you're new to barbecue, this is a great place to start, you know? Everything I did in this cook was incredibly basic and simple, but the result is amazing. I think it's time for the official taste test. Get one of these deboned chunks, shall we? You gotta work for it. Come on. There you go. All right, y'all, and that is it. That is how to make an absolutely fantastic rack of pork spare ribs on the Weber Kettle, Texas style. I highly recommend giving this technique a try if you haven't before. It's real easy to do. But that being said, if you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting that subscribe button. Let YouTube know by dropping a like on this video. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you want to see me cook next. If you give this recipe a try for yourself, be sure to tag me on Instagram at Chuds BBQ. I love to see what y'all are cooking. Big shout out to Fogo Charcoal. Thank you for sponsoring the Weber Kettle series here on Chuds BBQ. And until the next time I see you, please go cook something outside. Peace!